You may have seen this vintage, surrealistic painting around the internet. These were painted by the artist Qtonagi, who often uses elements of antique architecture in combination with vintage colors to create these dreamlike watercolor illustrations. If seeing these illustrations made you think, I want to be able to draw like her, or perhaps you wonder if there are any secret techniques that you can follow to be able to draw like her, then hopefully this video can help get you started. Because for today, I want to break down Qtonagi's art style by analyzing her illustrations and videos, and hopefully through my attempt, you can learn from my successes and failures. But mostly failures. And as a result, hopefully after watching this, you'll have a rough idea of where and how to start with your own Qtonagi-inspired illustrations. Lucky for us, Qtonagi was very generous with her resources. I went through her Pixiv and Twitter for finished illustrations, Pixiv Fanbox for sketches, Wacom interview for her background and inspirations, and of course, her YouTube channels for all the time-lapse, workflow, and live streams. And to start off, I started by analyzing the character proportions. We can see that the unique points of her characters were the super long legs. She often puts a lot of details into clothes and dresses, and in contrast, minimal amount of details for the legs. And for practice, I tried tracing and redrawing some of her characters, and then drawing my own using her proportions. I'm not really good at human anatomy, so what I did was draw out a doll-like face, arms, very long legs, and just fill in the blank with some clothes. And I think that kind of works for creating characters similar to Qtonagi. In a Wacom interview, Qtonagi mentioned that she liked antique-style items, which as we can see is a big part of her illustrations. For my attempt, I wanted to have an old-fashioned setting as my background, so I started by gathering pictures of really old photographs. I found that words such as 60s hotels, 60s gas station, vintage Kodachrome, vintage library, anything with the word 60s of vintage gave really good results. Ideally, you would want to use these as references for your background and not to trace the whole thing, which was what I did. And this was bad, not only because you won't learn much from doing this, but because the outcome looked very stiff, as you'll see later in the video, which is the complete opposite of Qtonagi's style. Again, referring back to the interview, she said that she preferred to draw the rough in a funya way, which meant limp or soft, but I'll just call it fluffy, since her line art looks somewhat fluffy. And this was one of the main factors that gives Qtonagi's illustration this dreamy look. The main aim was not to overthink the rough process. Don't think about drawing it too neatly and just have fun. And yeah, I did the complete opposite here. Right at the beginning, I drew the background using solid straight lines. And for brushes, what should you use? I think simply use a brush that mimics the texture of a sketchbook. I didn't look too much into this, but I think the main ones that she used were a pencil brush for the line art and texturing, then an opacity brush, almost like watercolor for coloring. For me, I used these brushes from Mark Brunet's brush pack, which I installed for a previous video. It's not perfect, but it worked well enough. If you know what brushes Qtonagi used, please let me know in the comments below. I decided to begin by breaking colors down into layers. So from this video, we can see that Qtonagi colored in the order of base color, white highlights, and then shadows. Qtonagi established the light source very early on, and those areas that were in contact with direct light are often bright whites. Notice how here, most of the colors were quite desaturated. Desaturated colors work naturally well with each other, so even though this blue might look saturated, it's actually quite desaturated, as you can see here. And for my attempt, my plan was to color in the base color, then white highlights and shadows, all while keeping in mind to paint only in desaturated colors. You don't necessarily need to know what colors you want to use, but having a go-to color scheme to create the antique look really helps, since most of her paintings have this reddish antique vibe. What does her color scheme look like? And does she have any go-to colors? And from what I've found, Qtonagi does have a series of colors that she used often, which we'll get into in a bit. So don't do what I did here and color in random desaturated colors and hope that somehow it'll just work magically. From my experience, painting without a plan can be quite demoralizing. If you don't know where to start, then following Qtonagi's color patterns that I'm about to show you could be a great starting point. Before I show you her color patterns, we first have to understand how her colors came to be and what were her inspirations. From the same interview, she mentioned, I used to paint mostly in black, but I gradually came to know what colors I thought were cute, and I started using light blue more and more. I still always use black in my paintings, but I have developed a pattern in my mind of color combinations that I like. And after going around eyedropping her works, we can get a clearer understanding of her color patterns. What color did she use? When did she use them, and where? To summarize, her color pattern were light blue for the sky. And for images without sky, sometimes light blue can be seen reflected on clothes and hair. Black or this dark reddish brown to create sharp contrast between the rest of the image, which were mostly used in clothing and accessories. Then finally, reddish brown hue were present all around the painting. This can be seen everywhere from clothing to hair to lighting itself. And don't forget the bright white highlights that was often used around the edges of the hair. This is in its most simplistic form Qtonagi's color pattern, and go-to colors for when it comes to coloring process. I don't really do painterly style illustrations, so my knowledge here is very limited, but I'll try to point out some tips and techniques that I've found to be quite useful throughout my study. For the brushwork and blending techniques, I'm gonna let Qtonagi demonstrate this because I'm just horrible at it. Where suitable, you would want to blend between two colors, for example here between the base color and the shadows. This can be done by eyedropping the in-between color and using that color to blend in between the first two. Even though I knew most of this when I started, putting them into practice was way harder than I expected. Personally, I struggled a lot with trying to paint in this thick paint style. Having to blend the colors in a way to show the form of an object was very challenging. I mean, just have a look at my hair time-lapse. I was trying to use light and shadow to describe the volume of the hair, but my lack of hair knowledge and coloring technique meant that in the end, I just gave up and left it white. Which, I mean, it doesn't look too bad, but it's uncharacteristic of Qtonagi's art style. Throughout the coloring process, I just couldn't get this reddish antique look. If you're like me and struggling to get that look, then a quick impromptu solution is to add a colored overlay. To do this, start by creating a new layer, fill it with reddish color, then setting it to overlay a soft light, and lowering the opacity. Qtonagi doesn't do this, but I've used this as a quick solution to fix the hue problems and to get that antique look. During the painting process, I had many of Qtonagi's paintings pulled up as references, which turned out to be a double-edged sword. Her style changed quite a lot throughout the years, meaning that sometimes her images were pale and had light values, while some had strong contrasting values. So when I referenced both, I was painting back and forth between low contrast and high contrast, loads of colors, and minimalistic colors. This indecision resulted in the outcome looking very confused and disordered. After finishing this illustration as part of Qtonagi's study, I wasn't satisfied with the outcome. The colors were not close to what Qtonagi uses, the lines were stiff, and the whole image was just a confused mess. The only thing that I was proud of was the drawing of the old-fashioned hotel background. Because I really liked the perspective, it looked really cool. So I thought, what if I made a simplified workflow? A simplified formula of sorts, which will be much easier for most of us to follow and still produce an outcome that respects Qtonagi's style. So I condensed all of what I went through so far into a simple 10-step formula for anyone to follow. And here's what I came up with. So with this formula, I decided to put it into practice and start my second attempt, which focuses more on the line art and colors. I started off by drawing a thumbnail, then a rough, and then the fluffy line art. It's still not that fluffy compared to Qtonagi, but it's much better than before. To redeem myself, I chose to focus on the character and the hair, so I didn't include background in this one. I painted the base color normally, keeping the color quite desaturated. I then went straight to the bright white highlights on one side of the hair and shadows on the other side of the hair. I did all this while referring back to Qtonagi's color pattern. Dark brown was used for the clothes, and since I didn't have a sky, I decided to add blue hue to certain parts of the hair as reflected light. Next, I blended the shadows and light to make it look more painterly. In addition, I used the overlay technique to give the image a slight brown hue. At the same time, Qtonagi did a live stream, and towards the end, she actually did something quite cheeky. She pasted a preset folder which contained adjustment layers inside, therefore giving the whole image the signature vintage look. Unfortunately, I couldn't see the exact settings, but I did see that she used 2 of these adjustment layers called selective color. This essentially allows you to change hue of specific color in the image. So in my case, I was just sliding the parameter around and made the pink color more brown, which fits with Qtonagi's color scheme. And for finishing touches, I used Gaussian blur to mimic a camera depth of field, and added paper texture to mimic a watercolor painting. And that was it. And I'm really happy with this outcome. The colors in this one turned out much better compared to the other one, which was super chaotic and confusing. My main regret for this second attempt was the face proportions. To truly get the same look as Qtonagi, the face should look much thinner. In conclusion, this video was meant to show you Qtonagi's style and the theories for painting like her. We didn't really go too deeply into the actual coloring techniques, but that's because I'm really not confident with it. If you want to see how Qtonagi paints and uses her brushes, I would recommend you to watch her more recent live streams. And in the end, the secret techniques, color patterns, and my formula are all just my presumptions of her habits and preferences. But hopefully this video can be used as a starting point for anyone who wants to draw like Qtonagi. If you have any artists you want to see next, feel free to comment below.